Today's program is entitled A Very Fine Place If the Harbor Were Good. And I would like to thank our generous sponsors this evening. I don't know if they're here tonight. Kate Pletner and Chris Van Duzer of Barnstable Marine Service. Are they here tonight? No? And William and Antonia Cook. Are they here tonight? Okay, good. Well, thank you very much in absentia. French explorer Samuel de Champlain left us remarkably descriptive maps and narratives of Cape Cod during his 1605-1606 travels along the New England coast. Our speaker tonight, Cape Cod National Seashore historian Bill Burke, will present an illustrated program taking a critical look at Champlain's vivid descriptions of the landforms, native people, and animals and plants that he encountered. William Burke has been the National Seashore's keeper of time for the past 15 years and a park ranger for the past 30 years. He's a wash ashore, which we won't hold against him. From Western Massachusetts, a former Eagle Scout, a summa cum laude graduate of Providence College with BA in History, and an MA from the College of William and Mary in Colonial History and Historical Archaeology. I'd like to welcome, with a lot of pride, Bill Burke.
Okay, microphone. Okay. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? Wow, that was a nice welcome. Boy, I feel important. That's great. I'm so excited tonight because I love the American Revolution, and I promise not to get sidetracked, and we'll stay on topic here with the Champlain topic. But to be in this building as a American history buff and Revolutionary War buff is like pretty special. And I know many of you come here for all the programs and you may start to take it for granted, but this place is tremendous. Having worked in Independence Hall, one of my first positions in the National Park Service, we talked a lot about, so I gave tours of Independence Hall, and 5 groups a day, 85 people each group. And there would always be a mix of 5th grade inner city Philadelphia kids mixed with the Chinese tour groups that needed an interpreter. That was interesting. But 2 years before those events in 1776 in Independence Hall, there was a lot happening here, which is just amazing. So tonight's program is on Champlain. And I think we all come to Tales of Cape Cod because it brings history to life. I think we all love history because we all really want to go back in time to see our grandparents, or to see a famous event, or to see Abraham Lincoln, or to see Native American life here. So we all want to go back, but we can't. So we try to grab a hold of the things that we can to try to paint the picture in our minds of what it was like. So we can use history books, and some of you are avid history readers. We can get old things, antiques. How many of you are antique lovers? So you get the material goods because it helps bring back what it was like in a past time. We have the archaeology, the stuff from the ground. We have historic buildings like this. So we all want to go back. And we all have our favorite time periods, I'm sure. So I look at history as a puzzle. And as the park historian for Cape Cod National Seashore, we have a lot of topics and a lot of buildings, lighthouses, life-saving stations, a tremendous collection of archaeology sites. So there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to the past. So tonight's topic, we go back 400 years, more than 400 years, to Champlain. And to make it even more of a puzzle, the whole program tonight will be in French. Just kidding. So in this puzzle that we're talking about, 1605, 1606, the French explorer Champlain. Why even study this? Why even do a program on this? My kids at home ask me that all the time. Why are you talking about Champlain? So I think there's three reasons for talking about Champlain. One reason is there's a lot of what-ifs. What if Champlain was successful in establishing a colony on Cape Cod in 1605? What if that happened? Would this be a French-speaking part of the world? Champlain was rejected here, didn't like it here, had a lot of conflict with the native peoples already living here. So he turned back, and this became English eventually. So there's a lot of what-ifs to this story. The second reason to study this story is the technology. 400 years ago, the technology was sparse. But you think about it, if Champlain had a GPS reader and he had a language translator thingy where you could speak to the native peoples in their own language. What if he had a watch? What if he had a tour guide? What if he had the things that we take for granted today? History would have been different. But, he didn't. And then the final reason to study, I think, Champlain, in my eyes, is we have this puzzle of 10,000 years plus of people living on Cape Cod before European colonization. The first people who lived on the Cape, 10,000 years. And what do we know about that? And if we had a big box with 1,000 pieces, and it was a puzzle, those big puzzles with the little pieces, and it's all fall foliage, the whole thing. How many pieces of the puzzle would be put on the table and set up in front of you? Out of 1,000 pieces, if we go back 400 years, how many pieces are in that picture? How many pieces? Is it 20 pieces of the puzzle? Would 500 pieces be visible based on the archaeology, the other evidence? I think that's a debatable question. I think if it was a 1,000-piece puzzle, the story of Champlain would probably have about 50 pieces out of 1,000. However, when Champlain came here, he left maps and written descriptions of what he saw in 1605 and 06, and that's really what we're going to focus on tonight. And I think he brings another 300 pieces to the table. So now Champlain gives us about 350 pieces total of what life was like at that moment in time when contact was made between French explorers and native peoples. So we've got maybe 350 pieces. Maybe you think you still only got 5, Bill. Don't worry about it. I don't know. And that is the greatest value of this story. To solve the unknowns about what Cape Cod was like, a place that we all love and live and enjoy. Was Cape Cod really different 400 years ago than it is today? And usually everyone says, oh yeah, way different. The traffic, the houses, the restaurants. But I think at the core, the land, and I have a lot of collegial discussions with the scientists who work at the National Seashore. I think at the core, the basic look of the outer Cape, where the National Seashore is, when you stand on the beach and you look up and down the beach from Chatham to Provincetown, with the bluff behind you, and much of the outer beach, the National Seashore, Nauset Marsh, Fort Hill, I think the landscape is not that terribly different than what Champlain saw. But that's my opinion. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're talking about the what-ifs of French colonization. We're talking about the lack of technology and how Champlain compensated for that. And we're talking about trying to fill the pieces of the puzzle because we all want to go back to a time period. Okay, so now what is this saying? I'm sure we have a couple of native French speakers. If not, I have a translation. Would anyone comfortable translating that nice and loud? No? Go for it.
I can't understand, or I'm unable to comprehend why other people consider women as negative or classics.
Yep.
Which are incapable of, we're not able to go on. Well, for my part, I understand that without establishing self-belief, nothing is possible to accomplish without the presence.
There it is. So in case you didn't hear that, I'll read the official version, but you were spot on there. It says, this is Champlain writing a little bit after the events at Cape Cod. He says, I don't understand why so many people consider women as a negligible quantity when they are unable to carry on without them. As for me, I am convinced that in any establishment, whatever it may be, nothing can be accomplished without the presence of women. Amen. And in fact, Champlain really learns the hard way because, as many of you know, Samuel de Champlain is the father of New Canada. He establishes the French settlement in Quebec, which becomes the capital of Canada. The English eventually basically take over Canada, but there's still today a very strong contingent in the Quebec area of the French. But the French always struggled with their numbers of people settling the New Canada, in particular women and families. And so he's talking, I think, with that experience, that there was a lack of the civilized world coming to help settle Canada. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm very impressed. Now, what do I point this at? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about who Champlain was. If I can, okay. First of all, there are no known portraits of Champlain. Sometimes in history books you'll see this picture. This is actually a painting of a French businessman from around the same time period. But it gives you the general idea of what was in vogue at the time in terms of clothing and facial hair and so on. One historian calling Champlain the most versatile of colonial founders in North America, at once sailor, soldier, writer, man of action, artist, explorer, ruler, and administrator. Champlain wrote about all of what he saw. In his original work for the French government, he was a cartographer, map maker, and also a chronicler of what he saw. And he also did sketches, these beautiful maps, and then there'd be sketches in the margins. And here we believe is a sketch of himself around what would be called Lake Champlain in his honor during one of these wars that took place between the French and some of the native tribes up in upstate New York and present-day Vermont. That doesn't really give you much to go on, though. In terms of the materials that he brought, what's physically left, we don't have a lot of pieces of the puzzle from Champlain. We think that this astrolabe, which was used for navigation, belonged to him. The ship that he was on, and he traveled between France and the New World 21 times. And generally on ships very similar to the Mayflower and other ships of the day. And I brought with me the main reason that Champlain and the French were here. Not a live beaver. I hope it's not a live beaver. Okay. So here's your beaver pelt. And as you can see with the image on the right, beaver pelts were in demand in Europe for hats because the pelt has a lot of waterproof fibers and fur. So we'll pass that around. They also traded for other furs that were used for luxury clothing in Europe, like the river otter. We'll pass that around. So the French were coming to the New World. Champlain at the time was the cartographer, the map maker. And they were the French, I'm really simplifying this, but they were after furs primarily, not really colonization at that time. May be hard for you to see this image, but Champlain, in part of his 21 back and forths, explored the St. Lawrence River Valley early on, down to the Quebec area, and then all along Nova Scotia, Maine, coast of Massachusetts, as far south as where we are. And one of the reasons for the intensity of exploration here was that the fur monopoly was given to Champlain's expeditions, and that monopoly geographically ran from Philadelphia to Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. So the French felt as though they had a monopoly to trade and gather the furs from the native peoples living in those areas. So Champlain left for us a number of remarkable maps that were very accurate for the day. Remember, this is 1607. Champlain is one of just a handful of French explorers that came to North America, starting with Cartier back in the 1520s. Here is a map showing the northern part of Massachusetts, up coastal Maine, Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia. It's one of his early maps. And then again, about 5 years later, we're down here right around Cape Cod, which didn't stick out quite as much for him. And then up the coast of New England, here's Nova Scotia again, St. Lawrence River. And then with all these voyages that Champlain had, he would map individual harbors and geographical points of interest. So here's a map of Plymouth Harbor. This is present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts. And for those of you familiar with Plymouth Harbor, this is actually still relatively accurate. And of course, this is all predating the Pilgrims who came 15 years later and did not really have a good cartographer with them. And then kind of the granddaddy of them all for Champlain, the 1632 map. Again, Nova Scotia, Maine, Massachusetts, Cape Cod, St. Lawrence. And Champlain, when you read about his biography later after the Cape Cod years, he explores much further inland into the Great Lakes and up into the upper parts of Lower Canada. Truly an amazing map maker. So when Champlain was here, they would send things back to Europe on ships. So they put a poor 6-month-old moose on board one of the ships, a caribou. I would have loved to have been on this ship, right? Horseshoe crab, lobster, birch bark canoe, bows and arrows, all sent back to France to try to whet the appetite of the French to come and settle in New Canada, to make a profit on the fur trade, harvest any other minerals that might be of value. There was a lumber trade. There was demand for sassafras. And so Champlain and others would send these things back. And you too can read all about this. All of Champlain's works have been translated into English, and they're readily available through interlibrary loan and so on. And you can read about all the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So one of the first settlements that is set up by the French is at St. Croix Island, which today is an international national park, or an international park, I guess you would say, on the border of Canada and the United States. And a very small band of about 80 French settlers and traders set up a first settlement site in 1604. This is predating Jamestown, which is 1607. It's predating the Pilgrims, which is 1620. It was a very unsuccessful settlement. The island did not have any readily available fresh water. But the French chose the island because they felt as though they could defend it from what they viewed as the potential threat of the native peoples. So over half of the people on this St. Croix Island died. It happened to be one of the worst winters in memory there. And they basically couldn't get off the island until late spring because they were iced in on both sides. And today, some of my colleagues in the National Park Service have done archaeological digs looking for some pieces to the puzzle at the St. Croix Island International Park. And they have found where the original fort that Champlain and others built in 1604. So, the French are unsuccessful at setting up a small colony and trading post on St. Croix Island. And so they turn their sights to the south, and they send an expeditionary party down towards Cape Cod. In the hopes, the early expeditionary parties were sent in hopes of getting all the way to Florida, according to them. But they had a hard enough time getting to Cape Cod, so I think they were lucky to get there. One of the timeless places on the outer Cape, which I think looks probably a lot like what Champlain saw in 1605, is the Nauset Marsh in Eastham. I'm sure many of you have been to Fort Hill in Eastham, which is right here in the picture. And that's a place within the National Seashore with great hiking trails. And we know that in 1605, Champlain's expedition in a small boat came down and lay anchor just inside the outer beach at Nauset Marsh. And this is where the quote that's the title of this program comes in. If the harbor were good, this would be a great place to live. Well, the harbor was not good. They called it Cape Malabar because even today it's shallow and there's a lot of shifting sand and very fast currents that empty out of Town Cove and Nauset Marsh. But in terms of the look and the feel of the place, if you go out on a small boat today, even though the coastline is much further inland, essentially that landscape is unchanged. And all along this marsh, in all these upland areas, Champlain records the native people living in great detail. And that is his chart of Nauset Marsh. If we go back, and then we go back to 1605, it's very similar. And so there is Champlain's boat, and there's the entrance. And then he depicts around the edges all the Wetus and Native American habitations. And he estimates that well over 200 native peoples must be living along the arch of Nauset Marsh. And he notices a great number of things, thus providing historians like myself some pieces of the puzzle to 1605 Cape Cod. Yeah, I'm just having trouble with that. Okay. So there's Fort Hill again. So if you go to Fort Hill, it's a great place to visit. We have the Captain Edward Penniman Whaling House, and then a series of trails that go through the area, and then Champlain's Nauset Marsh off in the distance. And this is what Champlain says. We found the harbor very spacious, perhaps being 3 or 4 leagues in circuit, entirely surrounded by little houses, around each one which there was as much land as the occupant needed for his support. A small river enters here, which is very pretty, and in which at low tide there are some 3.5 feet of water. There are also 2 or 3 brooks bordered by meadows. It would be a very fine place if the harbor were good. Many savages, men and women, visited us and ran up and all sides dancing. We named this place Port de Malabar. Now, many people will come up to me and say, Bill, reader beware. This is a European account of a culture that the French did not understand. And it's a European account that's probably embellished to make the place sound like a paradise. And part of that's true. I think the job of any history buff or historian is to take the source and consider who wrote it and why. You see the word savage, which is obviously in today's language offensive. For the French, the term savage was very complex. Essentially, they didn't understand these people. The people who were living here had some but very limited knowledge of the French. And what the French liked was that they seemed to be greeted by the people who lived there with people coming right up to their boats. So we need to take everything that he writes and have a critical eye. 1605 comes and goes. The French only spend a few days at Nauset Marsh. There is a small skirmish at Nauset Marsh in which at least one French sailor is killed by natives, and we think probably some natives were injured or killed as well. It was a small scale, what Champlain called a misunderstanding. So after 1605, the French move and they establish a new settlement. They do not go back to the St. Croix Island. They set up a place that they called Port Royal, which is basically where Annapolis, Nova Scotia is, on the Bay of Fundy. And they set up an order of good cheer in which they kept the spirits of the French settlers high during those first couple of winters. They built a palisade and they set up a trading post there, which was used year-round for a short amount of time. But they're still curious about what they saw in Cape Cod. So Champlain and his parties come down again in 1606. They come all the way back down the Massachusetts coast. They call Cape Cod the White Cape because of the bright sand that they're seeing. And they go past Nauset Marsh, Cape Malabar, and then if you know your geography, they're coming down the arm, past Eastham, and all the way down to Chatham. And there, they explore around the area that was settled by, at that time, the Monomoyaks, the native peoples who lived in pretty great numbers from what we can tell, from what Champlain says, what the archaeology says. There were probably close to 1,000 native peoples living in that Chatham area. Champlain calls it Port Fortune because his small boat that he's in, the rudder has broken and they're having a hard time navigating, and the incoming tide kind of brings them in, and so they called, basically where Stage Harbor is today in Chatham, they call it Port Fortune. And this is the chart that he has of what we would call Stage Harbor today. So Chatham Lighthouse would be over here on the right somewhere, today's Chatham Lighthouse. And then Morris Island, which is a little out of place in this map. And then the center of activity, the French spent almost 2 weeks here in 1606, right around this time of year. And from there, I think they made some tactical and diplomatic errors, if I was the French. But again, he doesn't have the pocket translator, and he doesn't really know the people. So, 10 days. When you have guests for 10 days, how does that feel? After about 2 days, right? I think what was happening when you read the accounts is the French were fixing their small boat, but they were sending expeditions out into the countryside. They were trading with the native peoples, but they were also kind of using a lot of aggressive body language. And just reading between the lines of the accounts, I think they were purposely trying to intimidate the native peoples, and there was pushback from the native peoples. Because the natives are, the first peoples are familiar with some European traders. They've had mixed experiences with some of those European traders. So they're very distrustful, obviously, of these new colonizers. And so there is a series of skirmishes that happen between the French and the native peoples. And those turn very ugly very fast. And I'm not here tonight to cast blame on either side, but we know that the skirmishes happened, and several people on both sides were killed. So these are the areas today, if you want to kind of retrace Champlain's voyages. Right down, you can see the Harding Beach Lighthouse there, Stage Harbor. And then if you're familiar with any of these landmarks in Chatham today, you have the little drawbridge, the Stage Harbor Marine. These are all areas, and even some of the street names reflect Champlain and the battles and the name Port Fortune. And there's other markers that have been put up over time in honor of the Champlain expedition. These are long quotes, so we won't read the whole thing. But Champlain goes into great detail about how the native peoples looked to him, how they carried their hair and how they dressed, the decorations, their weapons. And he made the observation, they don't seem to be great hunters, but they seem to be farmers and fishermen. And I think this was partly a product of the time of year. He was there in October. So they were probably still tilling the land with the last harvest and fishing and shellfishing. And it wasn't until the colder months that the first peoples would hunt more. He talks about the native way of sleeping. He's seeing the insides of the weetus and other shelters. Sleeping on reed mats. So for a historian, these are all pieces of the puzzle that are getting thrown on the table here. Yeah, they keep talking about fleas. I think the French translation, I'm guessing it's more, and this is October, so no-see-ums aren't really out, and the greenhead flies aren't out. I can't quite put my finger on exactly what the fleas were. Anyone have an idea? Gnats or mosquitoes? I say I'm not here to tell you everything because I don't know everything. Okay, so then Champlain captures in a series of diagrams what happens after the 10 days at Chatham. And essentially, it all gets kind of ugly when the French are on shore for an extended period of time and they are fixing their boat, and they've actually set up a very small little forge to fix the rudder, and they've also set up a temporary bakery to make bread on shore. And the rest of the French crew is on board the vessel. And after a lot of what appears to me, by reading everything, as bullying and intimidation, there is a feeling, I think, by the native people that the French people are overstaying their stay and are clearly a threat to their way of life. And so there is a skirmish in which an unknown number of natives are killed and 4 Frenchmen are killed. There are other accounts written not by eyewitnesses, but by those who interviewed the eyewitnesses. And one of those accounts is Les Voyages. And he talks about, and this is 1609, this is a few years later, he talks about how the French view native people, both on Cape Cod and mainly more up in Maine and Nova Scotia. And he talks about that the native people have courage, fidelity, generosity, humanity. They speak with much judgment and good sense. So some interesting things come out of some of the accounts. And then Champlain, long after Cape Cod is discredited and put aside and it's not going to be settled, and Champlain is now ensconced up in present-day Quebec, and he's going on some very long expeditions with the French, and he's meeting all different native tribes. And he kind of theorizes about what native peoples are really like and how they think. And this is interesting to read. Champlain really becomes very enamored with the native peoples that he meets. In fact, at one point he is injured in a battle and lives nearly for a whole year with a native tribe. And that's when he really, I think, starts to become even more sympathetic towards the native peoples and looking at things from their point of view. Okay. And just in closing here, imagination is the key to moral understanding, but Europeans, even those who moved to the New Worlds, remained incapable of recognizing the others they met as both different from and equal to themselves. I had this professor, so I had to read his book, so that's why his quote is in here, but it is a good quote. And of course, Champlain closes and Champlain lives until 1635. He dies on Christmas Day after finally founding a year-round settlement at Quebec. Makes great personal sacrifices, has so many adventures. And, you know, he dreamt of a new France. New France, a new world, not simply a kingdom, beautiful in all perfection. Consider the happiness people may one day have by inhabiting this country peaceably, free to live as they please. And again, the goals of tonight were to ponder the what-ifs of French colonization, to kind of ponder in a fun way the lack of technology and the technology that could have helped Champlain, and finally, to see how many pieces of the puzzle from this time period Champlain can give us as lovers of history. So thank you very much.